Russia's military industrial bases is actually running at full capacity. It's having real problems. It plateaued. Production actually went down towards the end of last year. So it went up sharply because of shortage of manpower, skilled manpower, because of corruption, poor management, and because of the way the factories have been run down. There's actually a problem with capacity. So looking ahead, Russia's going to have to take some serious measures to retool, expand, retrain those people working in its industrial base to provide the goods to re-equip the army. But that's difficult because you're trying to do the same time, churn out stuff to supply the war. So I think it's very difficult. And I think it will be an indicator of the Russian economy if it starts to convert civilian production across to military production. That shows, and going down that path, even more of sort of, say, national mobilization towards the war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we are talking to the former UK Defence Attaché to Moscow and Kyiv, John Foreman, CBE, a Royal Navy veteran. He's had military diplomatic appointments in the US with NATO and the EU and served on global maritime operations. John, welcome back to Frontline. Great to see you. Now, let's start with President Zelensky because he delivered his victory plan to Ukraine's parliament, and that was before presenting it to the EU summit, which he's due to do today. We're talking on Thursday. Was there anything in there that wasn't expected?
Well, thank you, Kate, and thank you for inviting me back. I think most of the sort of content had been trailed before when President Zelensky went to Washington, D.C. He's also trailed around the various European capitals, subsequently trying to build support for his victory plan. I think the core of the plan is deterrence, to deter Russia by punishment if it in the future tries to attack Ukraine, also to deter by denial by improving Ukrainian defences. I think the two things I picked out, firstly, was about the he wants an invitation to join NATO, which I think we knew about, but he's actually recognised the possibility of getting into NATO at the moment seems to be difficult due to lack of consensus amongst the allies. And I think secondly, it was much more emphasis on a non-nuclear strategic deterrent in the future, which by means long-range missiles to hold Russian infrastructure and cities at risk should Moscow decide to attack in the future. And of course, I think the problem with that is it butts up against the administration's concerns about escalation risk. By giving Ukraine the missiles to strike back at Russia, it's the same argument why America hasn't lifted restrictions on the missiles already provided. So I think it was a plan which has relatively good ends. I think the ways are joined up, but I don't think it has the means to deliver it because the means are at the behest of the Allies. And so far, the Allies haven't agreed to provide the means necessary to realise the plan.
And in that light, I presume you're saying it can't really make that much difference.
Well, I think it's an important statement of, where Ukraine wants to go. I think it's reasonably joined up. I think one criticism would be it's all about external support rather than what Ukraine itself needs to do as well. But I think the realism of the plan is in question because it depends on the Allies stepping up. And I think the Allies so far have shown they don't want to step up sufficiently to allow Ukraine to win. Rather, they've provided support enough for Ukraine not to lose.
And John, just to move on to a slightly different subject, drawing on your experience as a military attaché to Moscow. In his annual update on the security threats faced by the UK, the head of MI5, Britain's domestic security and counterintelligence agency, said Russia's intelligence agency is on a mission to generate sustained mayhem on British and European streets. Can you describe how Russia is operating to disrupt and destabilise and how these practices have evolved from what you've observed?
Sure. Well, firstly, I think it was important for the head of MI5 to put it on the record. But what he's really stating is what we've known for the last 10 to 20 years, that Russia's conducting a campaign of unconventional warfare, active measures against the West to distract us, to divide us, and to dismay us, and to defeat us. That's because Russia can't attack us, or doesn't wish to attack us conventionally by military means or by nuclear means. It uses unconventional means to achieve its aims. And that's the same Putin's been doing since he came to power, and also practically Russia or the Soviet Union has been doing since the 1920s. So although the means, I think, of that campaign have changed over time, cyber, social media, actually the ways and the ends of that campaign haven't changed. Now, the question, of course, is what do we do about it? I think we've seen a campaign of sabotage, of subversion, of corruption, of trying to divide us through social media, trying to misinform, disinform, trying to confuse voters, voter interference, all these things, including now these accusations of explosive devices being sent via aircraft, assassination threats against German industrialists. So you can see the breadth of the campaign. But actually, although we recognise the threat, I don't think there's been much resolve to actually do something about it, either internationally or by NATO or the European Union. Perhaps the penny will now drop now the head of MI5 has come out public and spoken about it.
And the head of MI6 had also said, Sir Richard Moore, the Secret Intelligence Service, that Russian intelligence services have gone a bit feral. So what does he mean by that exactly? What do you think has changed?
I think the thing has changed is not so much, I think feral's a great word. We know that Putin places an awful lot of investment into his intelligence services. The question is actually about risk tolerance. I think what strikes me is that Putin and his intelligence services are willing to take greater risk, to be more aggressive, even more aggressive, beyond the rules of the game as we've understood them, because of the wider campaign that he thinks that he's at war with the West, and that the ends, his conflict with the West, justify all the means necessary. And I think this has only been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine over the last 2.5 years, because the West has supported Ukraine. He pitches, or he frames his war with Ukraine as part of his wider conflict with the West, and therefore he sees us as co-belligerents, and therefore he can take all the means necessary to try and achieve his aims, which are to reduce support to Ukraine, to divide the West, and to weaken the transatlantic bridge with the United States. And one might say, in some ways, it's actually working, given the discussions about support to Ukraine in the future.
To what extent do you think that Russia, though, is turning to criminal elements to support what operations it might have below the threshold of war abroad?
Yeah, well, I read the head of MI5's report, and he made the point that actually we kicked out 700 intelligence agents and spies from Europe. So it's obviously, if you want to carry on doing what you want to carry on doing, and you can't use your professional intelligence agents, you have to look around for other ways to do it. Now, one, it might be illegal agents, deep cover agents, which Russia's had a long policy and program for, or using criminal elements to outsource, or we say, what you want to do to criminal elements in exchange for money. Or thirdly, perhaps to, one report called it the gig economy, to outsource it to people who are self-motivated on the internet to actually do it ideologically. So instead of having an ideology of communists and Cambridge spies, etc., now you need people off the internet. So there was the accusations that the people who conducted the arson in the UK weren't actually deep cover Russian agents. They were being recruited online, and they thought they were doing something else. So I think Russia's very imaginative, has long practice of doing this, of subversion activities, and I think that's what it's up to now.
And when you said earlier, the important thing is what we do about all of this, what do you think the countries that are being targeted should do about it? And what do you think, how seriously do you think it's being taken at the moment?
Well, I think in the UK, for example, there's a new National Security Council brackets resilience, which is chaired by the Prime Minister, which is to improve our defences. Not just military, but civilian. I think the biggest problem is actually not our military defences, although that's been discussed in the Security Defence Review, the Strategic Defence Review. What's more important, I think, at the moment is our civilian defences. I think Sky pointed out we haven't got a national resilience plan. All the sort of resilience planning we did during the Cold War was thrown away in the 1990s, and it's taken a long time for us to relearn that. And there's also a question of, is it just cyber defences? Is it just key infrastructure, or is it about our democracy in particular, which I think Russia preys on? But I think it's not just about deterrence by denial; it's also deterrence by punishment, and there hasn't been the same willingness, I think, to go after the Russians in the same way as we were willing to defend ourselves. And it's not just a UK issue, of course. It's it's not a UK issue; it's an international issue. So the point would be is, if you look to the NATO summit declaration in July, they recognised the problem, but there was no sort of step up at the NATO level to actually do something between the allies. So at the moment, because of national legislation, it tends to be each country individually doing its own thing. So I think we need more international coordination, more resilience planning at home, and a discussion about what do we do back to the Russians economically, cyber, should we say espionage, whatever, to take the battle back to the Russian side and to deter them from doing this in the future.
So a punitive attack below the
I
threshold
think
of what you think would be.
I think people like Ben Wallace have discussed this, and I think you have to look at the risk versus rewards, but I think you have to demonstrate capability and intent to use it. So before the invasion of Ukraine, the UK declared its offensive cyber capability, which was a reason. The question is, if we're going to deter Russia from doing this, we can't just try and put the defences up at home. We're going to have to try and attack the problem at the source and actually dissuade Russia from actually going after these attacks on us. And I don't think it's going to stop. I think they'll only escalate. And of course, somebody pointed out, if Russia wins in Ukraine, we can expect even more of the same against the West if we don't necessarily anticipate a military or nuclear attack.
Let's just briefly look at an area of interest for Russia, the elections that are coming up in Moldova and Georgia. In both, it's understood the Russian Federation would like puppet governments. How would the Kremlin seek to assert its influence if this does happen?
Well, firstly, I think Russia's had a long-term campaign to try and undermine the fledgling democracies, not just in Ukraine, but Moldova and Georgia. We saw accusations of pro-Russian figures in both elections in the past. Obviously, these become critical moments. We saw that happened in Montenegro, how Russia tried to affect the course of Montenegro's evolve to democracy and ultimately accession into NATO. So it uses all it means necessary, in particular money and corruption, to try and influence the results. I think it is important. I think Russia's ambitions are not just towards Ukraine. I think it wishes to subvert Moldovan and Georgian democracy and take them back into, we say, Russia's orbit. That's obviously obvious. I think if we should say more pro-Russian forces win in those elections, I think we could see those nations distancing themselves further from the European family, should we say. And I think actually of the two, Moldova stands a better chance. I think what's happening in Georgia is concerning because they seem to have been walking away from where we were 10 to 15 years ago, where their path was towards the European community and NATO.
Let's talk also a bit about the alliance between Russia and North Korea. How do you see that evolving, particularly in the light of reports that North Korea is about to or has sent thousands of troops to fight for Russia?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, I think firstly, we shouldn't be surprised. Putin visited North Korea. Kim pushed out the red carpet with knobs on to impress him. But the alliance began before. The defense minister had been there, other officials had been to North Korea, and vice versa. Kim had been to Moscow. So we can see the direction of travel. I think on the numbers, I've seen various reports. Is it 10,000 as Ukrainians say? Is it 3,000? Is it 1,000? I think the numbers probably at this stage are less important than the intent. We know that Koreans have been in Donbass because they were killed there. We know that they may be the advanced party of a further detachments coming from North Korea. Do they also work in the factories, as somebody said, because of the problems with personnel? I mean, the bigger question, of course, is Russia's facing a manpower shortage. It needs bodies. So it's been trying to get them from, obviously, in Russia itself. It's trying to get them from Central Asia, Africa, South Asia, now North Korea and China, by paying them huge money to come and work and fight in Russia. So I think it's an indicator, I think, of the deepening relationship between the two. Russia gets personnel and arms, and in return, North Korea gets tech, it gets aid, and it gets money. So it's a win-win. And I think it is destabilizing, not just the situation in Ukraine, but also in Southeast Asia, especially of the proliferation risk if Russia starts to give missile and nuclear technologies to North Korea.
And what developments have you seen in the challenges facing Ukraine in raising enough fighters for this war? Because we're seeing reports of them going on raids to kind of haul people out of nightclubs and various sort of social gatherings and sort of spot checks almost. What have you seen in terms of developments?
Well, I mean, one of the criticisms levelled at the Ukrainian government wasn't going in a war of national survival. It wasn't using all means necessary to drum up soldiers for the front. And President Zelensky brought in new mobilization laws in the middle of the summer. Apparently, that was more successful, and the Ukraine was getting more people to go and form and go to training and form new regiments and brigades. I think the problem is that those numbers are still less than the numbers that Russia can drum up. So it's not about absolute numbers, it's about relative advantage. I still think that Russia maintains an advantage of people in the field and also in arms. So I'm not surprised that people, the authorities, are trying to use press gangs to make sure people actually, if they're conscripted, turn up. I mean, it's nothing new. We did the same ourselves in World War I and World War II. That's the law of the land. The big question, of course, is whether it's enough. And the debate now is whether they lower the minimum recruitment age down to 21. Some allies have been pressing that, saying you'll get more numbers. But of course, what's the risk to Ukraine's long-term health if you start to denude the key, should we say, male population between 21 and 30 for the future of the country, especially as a lot of people have left the country already. So it's extremely difficult decision. I wouldn't try and tell Ukraine to do one thing or the other, but of course, in war is about necessity. And if Ukraine loses, whilst it's still got a huge reserve of people back at home, people question the logic of that.
Just interested to get your thoughts on the recent sustained attacks on the port city of Odessa. How much impact do you think this is having on Ukraine's trade and its economy? And what do you make of the timing of this sort of uptick in attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think Odessa, I've been to Odessa many times. It's a major port, given the way that the geography works in the Black Sea. They can't use Mykolaiv because it's near Crimea. I think it's one of the ambitions to use Mykolaiv, so it throws reliance back onto Odessa and the ports nearby in Bessarabia. I think Russia's determined to attack Ukraine's economic infrastructure and its energy infrastructure. I don't see what this is a new tactic. I think it's a continuation of ones we saw previously to try and stop Ukrainian exports, especially of grain. So remember when Russia pulled out of the grain deal, it immediately started missiling ports. So the question is, of course, is, as Zelensky asked in his plan, he wants more air defences and more support from the West to support the continuation of its economic infrastructure. And it's not just in Odessa, it's in Pokrovsk, it's in Kiev, this is across the country. This is a war against the whole country, not just on the front line. This is part of Russian deep operations, which they're very practiced at. So I'm not surprised by it.
The new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has visited the HQ of the new NATO Security Assistance and Training for Ukraine in Wiesbaden in Germany. It will coordinate Western military aid to Ukraine. In reference to the future deployment of US long-range missiles to the US base there, he said that NATO would not be intimidated by Russia's threats. And by that, I presume he means, the constant saber rattling you get from the Kremlin. If you look at delays to aid weapons, though, you could say this has already happened.
Yeah, but firstly, on the sort of US long-range missiles, that's a bilateral discussion between America and Germany about deterrence because of the stationing of Russian missiles and their use in Ukraine. So that was decided in the margins of the NATO summit in July in Washington. I think on the other issue about Rutte and weapons, I think there has been a sort of, I think Russia's deterrence has worked. I think the messaging, nuclear rhetoric, saber rattling has worked in the minds in Washington and some allies in Europe that there's a line at which they cannot go beyond in terms of approving or providing weapons to Ukraine to attack targets inside Russia. And that deterrence is having an effect on the battlefield.
President Putin, just to draw on his recent announcements about changes to the Russian Federation's nuclear doctrine, which was introduced in 2020, can you remind us exactly what those changes might mean and what do they tell us about President Putin? Are they a sign of his strength or his weakness, do you think?
Well, surely. I mean, Russia had been talking about changes to its nuclear doctrine throughout the summer. In fact, it started before the NATO summit. And I think, again, it was part of that rhetoric to try and deter allies from actually supporting Ukraine fully. Actually, if you look at what he said, and we haven't had the full text, so we have to be careful. What he said is he actually clarified really a couple of points, which, to be honest, were already in the policy document. So it's really a sort of political messaging rather than we have to go and look at every word in there and actually what it means. I think he increased ambiguity about when he would use it. I think he also lowered the threshold when they might use it in Ukraine or elsewhere, which would be concerning because obviously previously when we had a published document that was a basis of discussion between Russia and the other declared nuclear states in the world. In terms of strength versus weakness, Russia's got the largest nuclear arsenal. Putin likes to talk about his nuclear weapons. It's part of his rhetoric. He's got a great power sort of status, which he imagines for himself. But we can't wish them away. I think every consideration Americans have made in relation to Ukraine have a nuclear dimension because they don't want the war to escalate from a local war, quote, between Russia and Ukraine to a wider war with NATO. So possession of nuclear weapons, doctrines being published is all part of that sort of declaratory policy. Whether Mr. Putin would actually stick to that policy in actually extremis, we don't know. And of course, the worrying thing is we don't know exactly his risk versus reward calculations, also his decision-making process, which again increases risk and ambiguity strategically.
So quite a clever move then.
Well, I think all nations do it. We've got a policy, the Americans got a policy, the Russians got a policy, but I think because of the situation in Ukraine and concerns about escalation, that republishing and updating doctrine, we grab the headlines, for example, and of course, immediately before the Washington summit, the leaders will then think, well, look at Putin's updated his nuclear doctrine. We must be careful, quote unquote. And that's led to the sort of continued restrictions on Ukrainian arms and support being, should we say, hedged because of the risk of we don't want Russia to escalate vertically into a regional war horizontally by supplying arms to the Houthis or Iran or Venezuela or whatever.
Can you just outline the foreign policy dilemmas that are facing President Putin at the moment, particularly in the context of the conflicts in the Middle East? It's presented Putin with some difficult nuances to get right in relations with Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia, for instance.
Yes, I think previously, for example, Israel, I thought was fairly balanced and neutral on the issue of Ukraine. I spoke to the Israeli ambassador when I was in Moscow, encouraging them and asking them why they weren't supporting Ukraine more when he came from Ukraine. And they said, well, you have to understand it's part of our wider relationship. I think that's changed as the relationship between Iran and Russia has deepened. Iran providing drones and missiles to Moscow, and then discussions about Moscow providing weapons and modern jets and technology and know-how to Iran. So I think the Israeli-Russian relationship has been affected already by Iran. And of course, Iran's backing for the Houthis and Hezbollah, and Israel involved in that sort of war of survival against them. I think that's changed the dynamic there. I think Russia's relationship with Iran is also affecting Russia's relationship with Saudi Arabia. There's a BRICS summit coming up soon in Kazan. I understand that the Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince, won't be going. There's discussions whether Saudi will increase oil production to drive the oil price down, which will obviously affect Russia's budget going forward. So I think it's all in flux, and also Russia started to bomb cities inside Syria again in support of the Assad regime. So I think Russia has always had a historic role in the Middle East. It had relatively strong relations with a number of parties, the UAE, Saudi, Iran, Israel. I think the events of the 7th of October and the war are sort of playing their way through. And I don't think those relationships are quite as strong as Russia would like, despite all the rhetoric about it.
And what do you think China's long-term view towards relations with Russia is?
Yes, there's been acres of newsprint, if there's such a thing exists, on the Russian-Chinese relationship. I think firstly it's misbalanced. China is an economic powerhouse. Russia's declining power. I think Russia has unrequited love towards China, which is not reciprocated by the Chinese back towards Russia. I think the Chinese are very transactional, and taking Russia, have them over a barrel. So although Chinese imports exports increased dramatically, I think China's also sought to carry on applying sanctions regime because of fears about getting out of step with the Americans. So I think China is quite happy to carry on supporting the Russian war to make sure it doesn't lose as a hedge against America strategically, but not to the degree which it throws its hat fully in the ring. So you've seen this in these exercises. Russia had an exercise with China. It was very much the junior partner, and I think that shift, as people predicted, as Russia breaks ties from Europe and shifts, quote, to Eurasia and to the east, it's finding themselves very much the junior partner as a sort of outpost of the Chinese, and the Chinese are much more resourceful, much more powerful, and I think much more strategically minded long term, which Russia isn't.
And if you were to judge the state of Russia's war economy at the moment, how healthy do you think it is?
Yeah, I've seen the predictions, it's about to collapse. But unfortunately, people have been predicting collapses of Russia for, centuries. And certainly in the war for the last 2.5 years, the same people said that Russia was going to collapse in 2022. I think the problem about the Russian economy is not strong or as weak as it appears. So you'll see the sort of President Putin blah blah about we've got low unemployment, we've got growth picked up, the sanctions aren't working, but actually the sanctions have worked in reducing tech, and Russia's economy is overheated. I think Putin's budget for 2025 signals he's in for the long haul. Defence security spending is now going to be 40% of national budget. Defence spending is going up by 25%. And a lot of cuts are happening, taxes are going up, and cuts are happening in everything else. So defence security is now more than basically all the other bits of the economy put together: education, infrastructure. Everything's being sacrificed to the war in the short term, and the long-term health is being compromised. But he doesn't care about that because he's mortgaging the future for the present. So I think the key indicators really interest me is the oil price. Experts said that the budget for next year is predicated on an oil price $75 to $80 a barrel of Brent. Now, obviously, if Saudi starts producing more, then that's not within Putin's ability to control. So they're desperate for income. Mainly, the gas market has been destroyed with Europe. Therefore, they're throwing reliance back onto minerals and oil, which has to get to market. If income starts to drop, then they'll have to take even some more severe measures. But I think there are ways around it. You have very serious and significant macroeconomic managers in the economy who've done a good job keeping the show on the road so far. I think the economy is under strain. I don't think the National Wealth Fund is an indicator because it's meant to go up next year. But I think inflation is increasing risk and systemic fragility in the system in Russia, which makes the whole thing rather volatile.
And how does Russia address the challenge of rebuilding its armed forces while keeping up its production capacity, given what you've just outlined?
Well, that is the question, because you can't, the dilemma on one hand fighting the current war and then hoping to expand your army to 1.5 million people and rearm it for a potential conflict with NATO, quote unquote. Those are two different things. The stuff you need in the trenches and in Donbass is different from what you would need, should we say, to defend your country from a NATO-style, US-style assault, or even to, God forbid, to attack another country like Poland. So they're completely different. And I think the problem with Russia's economy and Russia's military industrial base is actually running at full capacity. It's having real problems. It plateaued. Production actually went down towards the end of last year. So it went up sharply because of shortage of manpower, skilled manpower, because of corruption, poor management, and because of the way the factories have been run down. There's actually a problem with capacity. So looking ahead, Russia's going to have to take some serious measures to retool, expand, retrain those people working in its industrial base to provide the goods to re-equip the army. But that's difficult because you're trying to do the same time, churn out stuff to supply the war. So I think it's very difficult. And I think it will be an indicator of the Russian economy if it starts to convert civilian production across to military production. That shows, and going down that path even more of sort of, say, national mobilisation towards the war.
And when you talk about the pressures of having to continue churning out stuff to supply the war, do you think those long-range strikes by Ukraine on ammo depots inside Russia are making much of a difference in terms of the supplies to the front line, or is that a blip that Russia is like to recover from?
Yeah, but I think they probably it causes tactical short-term difficulties, not long-term challenges. I mean, I think obviously, given the problems of capacity in the economy, you tended to see Russian long-range strikes against and drone attacks, missile attacks happen from time to time. So arms are saved up, they're all fired off over a couple of days, then they rebuild. They can't produce enough to do a like US-style shock and awe campaign over 100 days, night after night, day after day, across the whole country. So I think the Ukrainian strikes have had an effect, perhaps, on some of the storages of drones at the front lines, of missiles, equipment, logistics, fuel. But again, has actually slowed Russia's advance? No. And actually, the rate of Russia's advance has picked up since June in the Donbass, notwithstanding all these strikes. So we'll have to see. It's, again, it's a game of relative advantage between the two sides. At the same time, Russia is seeking to pummel Ukrainian military-industrial complex, logistic dumps, etc., railways and towns, and trying to interdict supply lines to the front line. So I think it's a bit of ebb and flow, but I don't see the strikes having had a strategic effect, operational effect, to actually slow the Russian advance.
And just to return to the challenges that are facing Russian society as Russia continues with its war effort, I'm just wondering how strong you think the Kremlin's grip is on Russian society and what methods it's using to placate complaints that people might have about things like medical services or salaries and that kind of challenge to daily lives.
Well, I think the grip's pretty firm, actually. Every time we have an event in Russia, people say this is it. Putin's grip is weakening. So said Prigozhin, this is a threat to his authority. Well, actually, Prigozhin was sorted out. He was killed, and everybody moved on. There was terrorist attacks in Moscow in the spring. Again, how can this happen? Putin's asleep at the wheel. He's not taking interest. People, the hawks are circling. Somebody said. Same happened recently with the Kursk incursion. Commentators were calling it magical. People in the Telegraph are saying hawks were circling around Putin, which I think is nonsense. Doesn't understand how power works in Russia. I think ultimately Putin doesn't care much about his people. So I think he's got a lid on it because of the security services, because of the climate of fear he's established. But also some people are doing quite well out of the war, especially if you work in the military-industrial sector. Other people, if you work in the car industry, have done terribly. If you work in the non-state sector, a non-government military sector, you're also doing badly. But actually, does he care really about that? If you cared about them, you'd be trying to do something about inflation, but inflation is soaring, and interest rates may go up again. Living standards are being hollowed out by inflation. Again, does he care? So how does he do it to placate it? I think it's less of persuasion nowadays. I think it's more about enforcement, and actually people saying, what can we do about it? There's a sense of despair and sort of general resignation to their circumstances. I don't see any opposition inside Russia or outside, which is going to shift the dial.
Why hasn't the Russian youth rebelled?
Well, I mean, I listened to a very interesting podcast by Mark Galliotti last night about public mood. I mean, people did come out on the streets when Navalny came back and he was arrested. People did protest in the early stages of the war, and they were dealt with severely. Got hundreds of people, thousands perhaps, in prison. You've got the message that no, quote, fifth columnists or traitors will be tolerated. You've got a very militarized society. You've got the fear of going to prison for 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, or being killed in prison. So I think it's very easy for us to say, why don't they rebel, quote unquote? But actually, if we've never lived in a totalitarian society, a dictatorship, people said the same thing about Nazi Germany. Why didn't you rebel? I said, what could we do? The chances of us being thrown in concentration camps or sent to the Gulag. Of course, you've had the example of Mr. Navalny, who was killed deliberately or by neglect in one of the Russian prisons. So if the Russian state can kill Navalny or Nemtsov or go after everybody from the biggest stars in the opposition down to a person liking something on social media or a girl in a school being denounced by their teachers, this climate of fear is so strong, and there's no rules or restrictions on the state's behaviour. I think that probably explains why there's not a much more visible opposition. I think people are against the war, a lot of people are against the war in Russia, but they've sort of resigned to their fate at present.
So from what you're saying, my understanding is that you think that President Putin's grip on power is like to last for really as long as he wants it to.
Yeah, I think so. I think we shouldn't have wishful thinking. We shouldn't hope for the best. I think we should just anticipate that Putin will be around for a while. He looks fairly healthy to me. I think his grip on power is fairly strong. I think obviously people recognise this damage has been done to Russia, but of course you have to, if you want to go against Putin, if you want to move against him, you have to succeed. Otherwise you see what the punishment is of what's happened to Navalny, what happened to Prigozhin. And of course that sent a message to the Russian elite that you are with me or against me. There's no sort of grey zones. You can't back out of this now. He's tied his elite and regime by blood. They're doing themselves reasonably well, I think. So I think rather than try and wish the problem away, we should deal with the problem head on, supporting Ukraine, tightening sanctions, making sure there's a legal route to prosecute Russia for crimes of aggression, crimes against humanity and genocide. I think rallying European nations to consider the long-term future of European security, the role of Ukraine in that, what sort of world do we want with Russia, the relationships with Russia, our strategy towards it, all those sort of things we should be doing now rather than hoping for the best and that Mr. Putin drops dead and Russia turns into Sweden or Switzerland.
And do you think the war will ever end while he is still in power? And if so, how?
No, I read an article. There was an article in one of the Russian papers said he cannot change course now. He's absolutely committed to this. He knows what happens to Russian leaders who lose wars throughout history. That's not been great for their health or those of their families or those around them. So I think he's absolutely set on this. His rhetoric, he said, I've got the quote here actually, he said on Reunification Day, quote, which is when they annexed the 4 provinces inside Ukraine, he said, truth is on our side, all goals set will be achieved. He reiterated his justification against the, quote, neo-Nazi dictatorship, slamming Western elites who turned Ukraine into their colony aimed at Russia, blah, blah, blah. So he's not changing course. And if that's the case, will the West rise to the occasion? And I also don't think we should think that Putin goes, things necessarily get better, they might actually get worse. The chances of a Western-style democracy breaking out in Russia are slim. It's much more likely to be a elite transfer of power, a Khrushchev to Brezhnev type transfer. And I think he also, even if he dies suddenly, there'll be churn, there'll be blood, but actually the impetus for the regime will be and the elites will be to carry on as before.
And John, just finally, if you were to take a step back and assess the war right now, what is your judgment and what do you expect in the coming months?
Well, I think Ukraine, to be blunt, is losing slowly. It's slowly being bled dry. I think Russia's suffering as well, but I think the relative advantage remains with Russia because of its size and its population and because of its ability to go around sanctions to keep the show on the road, however great the cost. I think the best case scenario of the winter is that Ukraine holds on. Biden is just succeeded by Harris. The US carry on and rallying support and supplying Ukraine, and some realization, the penny dropping in Western leaders, this is important, needs sorting out. The worst case is that the winter's very difficult, Ukrainian population frees, Russia keeps going forward, makes a breakthrough, and then Ukraine's forced into a peace deal, and the Trump wins and sells Ukraine down the river. And I think both those scenarios are possible. I think the most likely is the slow defeat, but we can't rule out a Russian breakthrough due to a collapse. So at this stage, I think Western leaders should not be overly focused on a domestic issues, like our Prime Minister, is very much time to rally support towards Ukraine.
John Foreman, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.